But Bitcoin is not just a new technology. It's something much bigger than that. And it's not just a new technology, it's a technological revolution. And so what is the difference? So a new technology is something that extends the life cycle of a previous technological revolution. So it might take something like a iPhone, for example, as a new piece of technology. And what it did is it took two pieces of technology, a computer and a phone, a computer and a phone, put them together, and it came up with this. And it's cool. But it's not a technological revolution. Technological revolutions are different in two main ways. And one, they change the course of humanity. And two, they drive financial markets. Okay? Now, there's only been 5 in the last about 300 years. There's only been 5. All right, and so we'll go through them, and then we're going to chop this up, and we'll kind of break it down, and then we can do some Q&A on this. But to kind of frame this, there's been 5. So the first one was in the late 1700s. We had the Industrial Revolution. That's when it all started. About 300 years ago, this whole world was dirt. There was no machines. There was no planes. There was no nothing. All right, everything that we had, almost all the abundance in the world came in the last couple hundred years. And so it started with that. And we had a machine that could do the work of 5,000 men. But what are those 5,000 men going to do? Well, it turns out science, medicine, things like that. About approximately 50 years later, we had steam engines and railways. Instead of horsepower, manpower, now we had machines that could move stuff across continents. It changed the course of humanity. About 50 years later, we had electricity and steel. Now, those are those new technological revolutions are new building blocks that allows us to build new things that we didn't have before. So steel allowed us to build skyscrapers before we could build 2 or 3 stories. We could build bridges. So it was those things. We had electricity. About 50 years later, we had oil, automobiles, and mass production, 1908. About 50 years later, 60 years later, 1971 was the age of the microprocessor, which brought us telecommunications and the internet, and Zoom, and the iPhone, and TikTok, and all that. And we're about 50 years later from that, about 2022, 2023, and there's another technological revolution happening. And that's where we believe Bitcoin fits in. It's not just a new technology, but it's a technological revolution. Now remember, 2 things. They change the course of humanity, and 2, they drive financial markets. So what have all the financial markets been driven by over the last 50, 60 years? Telecom, internet, computer. Before that, Ford, GM, GE. Before that, oil, steel. See how that works? The other thing is that they're always somewhat predictable, in which a new technology or technological revolution has to have a first killer application. How do we use it? So when electricity came out, what was the first killer application? Anybody? A light bulb. So what is this electricity thing, Brandon? I don't get it. Well, it's sort of like a digital candle, right? And it was that, but it became so much more. And so they have this killer application. So Bitcoin today has a killer application, money, and it's changing money. And we believe that it can change the course of humanity through changing incentive structures and drive all financial markets for a long time. So that's how big this is. We're at the beginning of this. And so let's dig into that a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah, what's up, guys? Happy to be here. Quick commentary on the scale of those technological revolutions. Today in America, the average individual consumes 2,000 calories internally, right? That's our food. But through this advanced technology, we harness about 200,000 calories per person. That's using advanced forms of energy like dense oil and machinery and things like that. So that's a huge exponential curve that we're all harnessing today. And when I think about this, like asking the question, like, what can Bitcoin change, right? It's a very hard question to ask because it is a new thing. It's a novel thing. It sort of disrupts all the systems we see. And Mark and I talk a lot about cycles, and I think right now where we are in humanity's cycle is that we look around at our institutions, and our institutions are decaying. We do not trust them anymore, and for good reason, right? The majority of the scaffolding of our society today was forged at the end of World War II, or right around there. That's FDIC, that's World Bank, that's NATO, the IMF, unemployment insurance, Bretton Woods, obviously, right? The list goes on. So those institutions were forged in a previous era, And in that era, let's say it made sense, right? That fits the needs at the time, the technology at the time. Fast forward 80 years, those institutions have decayed just through entropy, through corruption, through various different means, technological changes, right? They don't fit the current system. And humans are starting to notice this. We are pushing back on our institutions. The economic system's not working. The political system's not working. Who do we trust? And right during that crucible of change in our species enters this Bitcoin thing, right? This anonymous guy just drops a white paper on a pretty much no-name mailing list. And okay, that piece of paper, that piece of code went out and hijacked the minds of millions of people. It bootstrapped itself to $1 trillion at one point. There's no marketing officer. There's no CEO. There's no master plan, right? Just out pops this thing. And now we get to grapple with it. And we start to notice that humans really like this thing. It solves problems for us. And it might even solve some of those enormous institutional problems, right? It for sure solves the problem of savings if you're living in a regime with a crappy currency. It solves payments if you're in a country that can't send money abroad, or you have fragmented systems, or you don't have an identity, or you're persona non grata in the eyes of your government. It solves energy problems because we have the need to spread cheap, low-cost, high-density energy around the world, and Bitcoin helps us bootstrap that. But it just also might help us replace the institutions that our society is built upon. Maybe we don't need a central bank run by a dozen white dudes in a room steering the global economy. Maybe we can push that job to an open source protocol that we all contribute to that doesn't have the ability to be captured politically, like all previous monetary systems have done. And if that is true, then we can have a new monetary system, a new trust layer, a new value system for the world that doesn't break every so often because it gets corrupted. And if that's true, that's a new foundation to build. You mentioned steel. Maybe Bitcoin is the steel of money, right? Maybe that allows us to build bridges, which makes Manhattan what it is, builds the skyscrapers. And so, yeah, it is that new fundamental particle or building block for a society that's very hard to imagine. Yeah. We just have to speculate on that.
You talk about some of these institutions that are ancient and they're still being used in this modern age today. And so if you think about that, like one of the problems that we had is that thousands of years of modern history of using gold and things like that, where commerce was done on a local level. And so it's very easy if I'm holding the gold coin, I'm holding the gold coin, and if I hand it to you, you're holding the gold coin. And we had that. But as soon as the world started to expand, really in the 1500s, we started having this global trade. And then all of a sudden, we're having to trade across borders and across oceans. And settling gold, final settlement, became very difficult. And so we needed a new form of technology. It's always technology. Thousands of years of history, it's always technologies that change things. And doesn't just change the way we do things, it changes the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we organize ourselves, where we live, our institutions, etc. And so we need a new piece of technology, and that new technology was called a ledger. And the ledger would basically keep track of who had the gold coin. And so he's in one continent, I'm in another, and whoever held that ledger could then say, well, Brandon has the gold or Mark has the gold. The problem is then that introduced trust. And so now we have to trust who's ever holding that ledger. And so for then another couple hundred years go by, gold continues to get centralized, gets put into vaults. And that's basically where we're still at today. Here we are about 500 years later after that ledger has been introduced, and we found that trusting institutions doesn't always work out so well. We found that centralization leads to manipulation. And we found that when we trust central entities with our data or with our money or with whatever, then they tend to violate that trust. And so I like to say that solutions are supposed to come to problems. And so that would create a very big problem. And so then there has to be a new technology or a revolution. So how do we solve that problem? And that's where Bitcoin comes in. It solved the problem of who has the ledger, which of course nobody has the ledger, or I should say we all have the ledger. Let's jump forward. I mean, everyone kind of gets the digital gold, digital money, Swiss bank account in your pocket. I think you guys already got all those value propositions. We don't need to lay that down. But let's kind of jump back into like this future casting a little bit. So if it's a technological revolution that can change the course of humanity and drive financial markets, like we've laid out the examples of before, a couple things I think about. A lot of times you might hear financial analysts, talking heads on TV, whatever you want to call them, talk about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency as an asset class. Well, what if Bitcoin has every asset class built on top of it? Right? So that's one way. And we don't know. First of all, humans are no good at imagining the future. Brandon and I are not good at it, neither are any of you. And that's the reason why is because all we can do is imagine a better version of what we have today. So if we have cars, we'll have flying cars one day, right? But what happens is when we have a new set of building blocks, it allows new things to be built. And then when those new things are built, then we can build new things with those. And so like in the early days of the internet, if any of you guys, I know some of you guys are old enough to remember those early days of the internet, it was like, oh, well, we'll use it for like message boards and like maybe one day we'll buy stuff online, I think. Like that's kind of what we thought about in the mid 90s. But we didn't know that our cars would be hooked to something called a cloud using something called social media to navigate us around traffic because we didn't have social media. We didn't have a cloud. We didn't have those building blocks, right? And so so we don't know, right? So we're just kind of imagining here. But as far as the financial markets, it would be easy to see that maybe all the financial markets could be built on Bitcoin, all the assets in Bitcoin, and not just it being one asset class. And we'll table that for financial markets. But let's talk about changing the course of humanity. So I'll start. One of the big things I like to think about is Charlie Munger's quote that show me the incentives, I show you the outcomes, right? And so if you think about incentive structures, I believe that we should be, I believe business owners are servants. I believe that we're trying to solve problems and serve other people's needs. That's how we get ahead in the life. And I think that we should have proper incentive structures to do that. And so what happens is when incentive structures are misaligned, for example, an extreme example would be if I was living in an African country under a bloodthirsty, dictator warlord, for example, I would have no incentive structure to allow me to save and to create and to innovate because I know that anytime he could come just kill me and steal all my stuff or just steal all my stuff and leave me alive or whatever. And so I'm just basically just kind of living, right? And the warlord also has the same incentive structure where he knows he doesn't need to provide any value because anytime he wants, he can just come take my stuff. So neither of us, both me and the warlord, are not providing any value to the world. Neither of us are doing anything of value to humanity. Neither of us are doing anything to innovate or push things forward because of that incentive structure. Now, if we flip that, where all of a sudden I can save in a way that he can't steal from me. Now all of a sudden I'm incentivized to think long term. Well, shoot, now I can save, now I can build, now I can think long term, now I can innovate, now I can come up with new ways that I can, use my resources more efficiently, etc. And the warlord also goes, well, shoot, since I can't steal from him, I guess I need to come up with a way to provide value to him so he'll give me some of his money. And so that one small shift went from both of us, neither of us providing any value into the world to now both of us trying to figure out how we can put maximum value in the world. Just one small shift in the balance of power. And that's one example. We don't know how big that goes.
Yeah, just to reduce that down to some simplest form, Bitcoin essentially shifts power away from the political class and puts it in the hands of the productive class. And that one base incentive can cascade into all corners of society.